Well, joining me now, Sky News host and News Corp columnist Peter Credlin. Look, this is a really interesting scenario, isn't it, Peter, where you've got the South Australian government essentially closing its borders, making sure that it tries to get on top of this particular outbreak, and yet we've also got criticism of some states who are basically saying no travel from South Australians into their particular states or territories. I guess in many ways, you think about the Federation and what the Federation was set up for. Right at the moment, it does seem a little bit broken, doesn't it?
Well, absolutely broken. And I think it's been broken in a policy sense and a financial sense for a very long time, Gleeson. I mean, you've got these infantilised states and premiers who, whenever they get into strife or they get the budget into the red, they race to Canberra with their bigging bowl and they want to be, bailed out. But they also then say that they want to be taken seriously and they want to flex their muscles. We've seen that in Victoria, we've seen that in Queensland, but they don't act like grown-ups. I mean, the idea that you'd shut down a state like this for a week on the back of 22 cases when you know where the cases have come from. They're not unknown community transmission. It's not 700 cases like Victoria. We're talking about 22 cases, all of them linked to a known outbreak. You don't shut down the state. I mean, I said on my show, Gleeson, you would not want to go to war with these premiers. They are weak. They are rudderless. There's no ticker, no backbone. They should now, this is not back in February, this is not the start of the crisis. By now, we are in mid-November. They should have crack contact tracing and testing regimes. People shouldn't be standing in a line for 10 hours in the Adelaide sun. They should be on top of this. They should be absolutely ready to manage it. And if they can't, people should be sacked, moved out of their roles in the public service and good people brought in. Because I tell you what, if I worked for a leader with this sort of track record, shutting down the state on the back of 22 cases, I would hang my head in shame. And Stephen Marshall should do the same. He has had plenty of time. He needs to just turn on the TV, look at Victoria, and knows that he needed to get his house in order. Clearly, he doesn't even trust his own systems. I think it's crazy.
And you know what? The other thing, Peter, is our contact tracing here in this country has proven to be, absolutely gold medal standard when you consider other places around the world. And of course, David Pemberthy, I thought, let's exclude Victoria. David Pemberthy, our News Corp columnist colleague, I think nailed it today in the Oz when he said there would be rejoicing in the streets in some parts of Europe and the US if they had just 22 cases on the ground. They're not shutting their borders. They're not locking people up like they are in South Australia. You're right, Peter Credlin, this is a disgrace. And somehow, and I've been saying this for months, in war and pandemic, the Commonwealth needs to take over.
I also think that reasonable people need to speak up here, because we are going to do ourselves enormous economic damage. We'll do ourselves enormous harm in terms of all the other consequences in health terms that people are suffering. I had a doctor on my show last night who deals with young children. She wrote to the Premier in Victoria and kicked off a whole debate about the mental health of children in the lockdown in Victoria. She hasn't got a letter response from the Premier. That doesn't surprise me. But she's still seeing the ramifications of the lockdown on kids. It's still escalating in Victoria. Even though they're out of the lockdown and the kids are starting to go back at school, they're still presenting with all the issues they were presenting with weeks ago. Now, we're talking about 6 days. We're not talking about the same thing as the Melbourne lockdown, but it's the principle, right? If we lock down for 22 in South Australia, what happens when they get to February or March next year and they get another 22 or a 40 or a 50? They'll lock down again. Victoria, we saw in evidence today from the chief scientist, the Commonwealth chief scientist, that their house is better than it was in terms of contact tracing than it was at the start of the year, but it's still, the house is still not in order compared to New South Wales, compared to Queensland. And what happens if Daniel Andrews gets an outbreak in and around New Year's? He'll shut the state down again. And we're going to learn to live with this virus because, yes, we've got these promising vaccines, Gleeson, but some of them require 2 jabs. There's obviously a lot to be manufactured here and around the world. We may not get everyone vaccinated if it comes off before the end of next year. So come on, do all the right things, protect our most vulnerable, but let's not just kill ourselves economically. We're talking about $1 trillion of debt. We're almost out $1 trillion worth of debt, and deficits as far as the eye can see. If the deficit is $106 billion in New South Wales, as announced yesterday, God help it in Queensland, right? You guys will be drowning in red ink.
Drowning in red ink, absolutely. It's suppression. It's not eradication when it comes to this pandemic. Now, I want to talk about the Prime Minister's trip to Japan yesterday. You've been at the cutting edge of these international bilateral relations when you were with Tony Abbott. Significant, very significant. The first overseas leader to meet Mr. Suga. Of course, the Chinese have come out today and have been quite critical of the pact that was, particularly the military pact that was put together by the two nations. What did you think of Prime Minister Scott Morrison's visit to Japan?
So it was all very deliberate that he decided to go to Japan as the first country he visited once we were out of the COVID travel restraint, if I can say it in those terms, over the last few months. Tony Abbott started the debate with Japan, the conversation, to be fair, the conversation with Japan about developing more military cooperation. Obviously, we all have that history. My grandfather fought in the Second World War. We all have that history in the West with Japan in the war. But his argument was they're regionally very important to us. They're an important counterweight or counterbalance to China. They have behaved incredibly well since the cessation of hostilities all those years ago. And if countries like Germany have been brought into the fold, then we should find a way to do business in a military sense as easily as we do in an economic sense with Japan. And Japan's shown itself to be a good democracy, a great democracy, in fact. So there was a willingness then on both parties. And that's now been progressed. I think it fell away a little bit with Malcolm Turnbull, but certainly progressed by Scott Morrison. I think it is a very good thing. It sends a message to China that we're not going to be patsies in the region, that we will have our own friendships and relationships above and beyond our relationship with the United States. And I think it's a good agreement. I think there's a lot to be admired in the agreement, and the military cooperation and the interoperability and the involvement in terms of exercises of our two nations will be important going forward. The Chinese don't like it. That tells you it's pretty effective then.